Yes, meeting has started.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Australian Society for the Polish Jews and Their Descendants webinar. Our aim as a society is to preserve and promote Jewish heritage in Poland and foster understanding between Polish and Jewish communities across the generations. I'd like to welcome our special guests. I'll talk about them at length shortly. Marta from Lublin, Janine from Baltimore in Maryland, Yvonne Haber and family. She's very important in this story. And Marina Sira in Warsaw. I'm going to start by telling you how this very unusual story came about. My ancestral town is Lublin, and I'm on a lot of email contacts about Lublin, and something came in. I got this interesting notification about a woman called Marta who was writing about orphanages and nurseries in Lublin before the war. I had just recently found out that my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, had been the cook at the Lublin orphanage, which had also been the Judenrat headquarters. And it was such a revelation for me. And I asked Janine if that's, not Janine, sorry. I asked Marta if that's who she was talking about. And she said, no, in fact, the timing is different. However, I am very interested in your grandmother. And she'd been trying to find who was the cook of this orphanage. And here I was, 1,000 miles away. So that led, as they say, to a beautiful friendship, because I realised that Marta could help me a lot with my research about Lublin. I was going to travel to Lublin with my daughter. She very kindly offered to take us around and show us the Jewish areas and things like that. Then I said, well, what's your main area? And she said, well, I have many main areas, but one of my real loves is poesy books. And I said, oh, poesy books. I, by the way, was a guide at the Sydney Jewish Museum. And I said, oh, the Sydney Jewish Museum has some poesy books. Why did I know that? Because we had the Anne Frank International Exhibition, and we had 3 poesy books in our collection. 2 were from Holland, from the Netherlands. And I remembered when they were on display, and I remembered the word poesy books. But there was another one that was not on display because it was Polish. The 2 Dutch ones had been translated, but the Polish one had not. So in the back of my mind, I was thinking, oh, this professor from Lublin, I wonder if she'd be interested in translating it. But I didn't have to ask her, because when I told her the story, I found out the story behind this beautiful book, which is on your invitations. It was so intriguing and such a lovely item to touch. And Marta very kindly and with great passion offered to translate it as a homage to Helena Tabañska, whose book it was. And so this serendipitous event led to A, a friendship, and B, a lot of information for me, and C, the translation of this Polish poesy book, which is just for which this museum is extremely grateful. So thank you, Marta. So I will now introduce our 2 speakers. Janine Holc is Professor and Chair of the Political Science Department at Loyola University, Baltimore. One of her main research areas is the experience of Polish Jewish girls and young women in slave labour camps. And Marta Kubiszyn is Associate Professor in the Department of Jewish Culture and History at Maria Curie-Skłodowska, did I say that right? University in Lublin. And she's particularly interested in memory and Holocaust studies and objects, which she'll probably tell you about how that fits in with this poesy books. They have just published this amazing paper joint paper on the things we're going to discuss tonight, and it's in a very prestigious journal of Holocaust and Genocide Studies, and the title is Autograph Albums as Holocaust Objects, Hapticity, Futurity and Trauma. Now, just a word of clarification. Poesy, you'll see that poesy is spelt with an IE or a Y. Just ignore that. It's just, it's different spellings, same thing. And poesy is an old-fashioned word for poetry, but in Europe, they prefer, correct me if I'm wrong, to use the word autograph or friendship albums. That's more commonly used. But in Australia, in particular, an autograph album is not very much like the poesy and autograph books that we are talking about tonight. So that's just to clarify that issue. So we're going to start in a moment. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box whenever you like. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Janine, who's going to introduce the whole concept of poesy books.
Thank you, Rita. I'm going to share my screen. Is that okay? Can you see it? Okay.
Yes.
So as Rita said, first of all, thank you to everyone. Thank you to Rita and the Sydney Jewish Museum and everyone who's here for hosting myself and my co-author, Dr. Marta Kubiszyn. And I'd like to just begin by introducing the larger project Dr. Kubiszyn are working on, the poesy books or autograph albums created by Jewish girls and young women in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe. Both poesy books and autograph books are bound booklets of blank pages, and the purpose of owning one was to collect verses from your friends and acquaintances. These were very small and easily carried and hidden, which might be one reason people brought them even in times of great stress and fear, such as World War II. They were very popular, especially among girls. Some people here in the meeting might have had one when they were young, throughout Europe, Australia, and North America in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So here's an example of one. This is not Helena's album. This is from a Holocaust survivor. You can see how small it is. I put my hand in the pictures. You can see how easy it might be to hand from person to collect signatures. This album belonged to Irena Ravolova, a Jewish Czech woman, and she donated it after the war to the Jewish Museum in Prague. In our project, we examine the poesy books, autograph albums that Jewish girls and young women carried before and during World War II. And these are held in different archives all over the world. And amazingly, we discovered that as the Nazi threat closed in, these girls and young women brought their albums with them into hiding, into ghettos, and into forced labor camps. They even circulated them in those camps and in those ghettos for signatures and short verses. So in our larger project, we analyzed these poesy books, autograph albums, through the frameworks of social connection, touch, future making, and memory. So I'm going to turn to another quick example before we get into Helena Tabañska's book. Here's another example of a book we found. This is a handmade cover made by young women in the forced labor camp called Partitions. It is currently held at the Yad Vashem archives in Israel. And here are some pages from the inside. This is a handwritten, self-composed poem by another inmate for Dvora's birthday. These verses reassure Dvora that better days will come in the future. The rest of the book has signatures and short verses from other campmates. It was given to Dvora on her birthday in the camp. So I just want to do a little bit of a close-up here. This slide takes a close look at the sign-off under the first long poem, and it says in Polish, some of you will be able to understand it, "Beloved Dvoshi, I wrote this as a souvenir for your birthday, Aunt Greta, Camp Parshnitz in December 1944. So notice the care and connection of Auntie Greta's intention, the touch contained in the careful beadwork on that cover, the wishes for future in the poem, and Dvorak's choice to save this item after the war and donate it to Yad Vashem. We notice all of these things when we look at all of these different poesy books, autograph albums that survived. I will now turn to my co-author, Dr. Kubiszyn, who will take all of this and share how both of us, but she especially analyzed Helena Tabañska's autograph album.
Thank you, Janine. Thank you, Janine, for this wonderful introduction on these poesy books or autographs albums, as we call them, and on our research project. Now I would like to talk about this album of Helena. Helena was born in Warsaw in 1889. Entries in her album started in 1905 and continued up to 1908 while Helena was attending a high school for girls in Warsaw. So this photograph you can see on the slide shows Helena at around 29 years old, which is about 10 years after the last entry in her album appeared. And although Helena album is different from other albums we focus on in the project, it occupies a special place in our research. So why is Helena's album different and why it is so special? First, it's different which is obvious because of the time period. In our research, as Professor Holc already said, we focus mostly on the albums that were created in the 1930s and 1940s, and this album was created much earlier. It was kept by a Jewish girl attending Pensja. Pensja is Polish boarding school for girls for girls, and we know her as Helena Tabañska. But then, in 1905 or 1908, when she collected the entries in her album, her name was Haya Sieniotycka. And Haya was a girl from a wealthy Jewish family. Together with her parents and her brother, they were living in Warsaw. And the family was aiming at acculturation, as a number of Jewish families in big cities did during this period. So they attended the synagogue and respected Jewish religious holidays, but at the same time, they wanted to participate in Polish national culture. And this Helena's album is a historical testimony of this process, to this process. So Jewish parents paid for their daughter to be educated in a quite a progressive Polish high school for girls. And in the album, there are no entries in Yiddish. The entries are in Polish, French, and Russian. And third thing is that Haya herself changed her name to Hela. Hela is a diminutive of Helena. And that was the name her school friends, teachers, and her family members called her by, as it is clearly documented in the album. So that's the first thing, why it is so special. The second thing, very important, is that in this time period, 1905, there was no Poland as an independent state. At the time, Poland was under partition and Warsaw was under Russian rule. As a part of the Kingdom Poland or the Congress Kingdom. So Poles were subjected to Russification, which included restrictions on the use of Polish native language in schools and institutions. However, Poles resisted the Russification in various ways. So Polish culture, Polish language, tradition, and customs were maintained through literature and poetry. And Helena's album shows how these Pensja students, among whom there were also Jewish girls, participated in the process of protecting the Polish language, Polish literature, and their national values. Can I ask for the next slide, please? Okay, so here on this slide, you can see the names of the Polish writers who were included in Helena's album. So most of the entries were written by the most prominent Polish writers like Adam Mickiewicz, Maria Konopnicka, Adam Asnyk, Kazimierz Przerwa-Tetmajer, or Stanisław Koźmian. So the next slide, please. And here is on this slide you can see one of the poems. This is a poem by Stanisław Koźmian. He is an author of a very popular, extremely popular patriotic poem praising the divine sources of the Polish language and the unique roots of the Polish nation. This poem was included in Helena's album by her school friend Helena Tabañska. And on the left, you can see the original entry. In the middle, you can see the transcription in Polish, and on the right, you can see the translation from Polish to English. Of course, this is just a translation we made for the purpose of the research. By entering this poem, Tabañska positions the Polish language as a no flower of the foreign lineage, expressing resistance to Russification. And in the context of this period, this inscription is a political statement. Can I ask for another slide? On this slide, you can see a poem. The entry on the left with a poem by Adam Mickiewicz. It's actually a fragment of a poem, and there are a number of entries in the album that include short poems or which were very typical for the genre, which include advices regarding education, love, and the values that should guide one's life. As you can see on the slide, the entries usually include a signature of the author at the bottom and a date. This particular entry doesn't specify the location where the entry was made, but usually such information is also included. So most of the entries in the album also include a short comment from the author, some wishes for the future, and requests that the owner of the album remember their friendship forever. Can I have a next slide, please? Oh, such a dedication you can see on this slide. This is an entry included by Helena's cousin, Salomon Wittenberg. As you can see here, the whole text was written with a careful, elegant, and meticulous handwriting. And the manner that the entries were written in the album show how the beauty of the handwriting was appreciated back then. With this decorative first letter of each line, this entry demonstrates aesthetic values of the album. Can I ask for the next slide? So this is in the middle. You can see the most mysterious entry in the whole album. Or maybe I will talk about the cover first. So on the first slide on the left, you can see the cover of the album. This is a very elegant velvet cover with a golden leaf or a flower on it. And the paper is very elegant, and the appearance of this object tells us that this album as a material object was valued by its owner. However, what is even more important for us, the album bears material traces of being viewed, read, and touched many times. This page that you can see in the middle is a declaration of love. It was most likely written by Helena's future husband, Abram, It is handwritten in Russian, and it was transcribed and translated by Marina Sira, Rita's friend, who is with us today. And thank you, Marina, again for your work with this project. So it translates as, "Can you hear me loving you? So passionately loving." And there is no date on the page, so it's difficult to determine whether this entry was written before the wedding or during their marriage. This is the most personal, the most intimate entry in the entire album, somewhat outside the convention of the autograph album genre. Abram does not include a poem. He just expresses his love and passion toward Helena. And this entry also is a trace of appearance of Abram, who is also the future father of Krysia, of Helena's younger daughter, who was the one who carried the album as a memento of her mother and her father. She took this album with her as she escaped from the Warsaw ghetto in 1943 and carried it with her when she was hiding with a Christian family, and later when she was forced to leave Warsaw and live in a province pretending to be a Christian herself, and later on during her post-war immigration. If you look closely at this page, this middle image, you can see the traces of touch in the lower right corner. So the corner is worn and darker than the other pages, which shows that this page was touched and viewed many times, probably by both Helena and Krystyna. I will end now, although there is much more to discuss, and I will end now to leave time for questions, for discussion. Thank you.
Oh, do you want to talk about these photos?
Oh, I'm sorry. I should. Yeah, that's on the left. You can see Helena with her daughters, Irena and Frederica, who later changed her name to Krystyna. In the middle is Abram Tabañski, the husband, Helena's husband, and the father of Irena and Krystyna. And on the right, it's a picture of Krystyna Turek recording a testimony for the Shoah Foundation in 1996. Thank you.
Thanks, Marta. So what happened, the next part of the process was the translation. And this we had a very, very interesting time. Anouk, could you, thank you. I call this slide the perils of translation. There are lots of factors here. The first one being that I don't speak, read or write Polish, but that didn't matter because I had Marta to do that. The other wonderful thing was that Marta's English is excellent, but the nuances in both Polish and English were very challenging. So what ensued were months and months and months of toing and froing. Marta translating, a particular poem, and then I would go through it and say, no, it shouldn't be this, it should be this word. This is a better word to use. So it went on and on like that in the, what's it called, where you make comments when you're editing. So it was a really, really difficult process because there were so many factors to think about. Do you use the exact wording, the exact translation, which can cause you to lose the emotional side of what this poem was about? The very fact that they were 19th century, mostly 19th century poems, very elaborate and very purple prose and lots of lyrical language and, and so many sighs, and it was very, very complex to try and get to the kernel of the meaning. Then there was the biggest problem for me particularly was, do we go for the Polish idiom or the English idiom, the English language idiom, or do we put it into 21st century language, which would give the wrong feeling because it was actually 19th century poetry and therefore 19th century language. So there were, the biggest problem with Polish is that there's no the in Polish and no or an, which for an English speaker was really, really challenging. And I'm going to show you an example in a moment. So the whole old world references and the literary concepts made it an interesting, but, really quite difficult at times. And look, can I have the next slide, please? So again, just randomly, I chose Stanisław Koźmian's poem as well about Polish speech to show you some of the processes. The first one in the green, Marta sends me this and I say, well, rainbird, that doesn't work in English. And this is Marta's own analysis of what rainbird might mean. She says it's not really a word in Polish either, but, it really says something, it makes rainbow into a verb. And so that was an interesting discussion. Then this one in the blue, inspired by your tune or the cadence of your language is inspired by the God. So immediately the comes up as the problem. And do you say inspired by a God or God? Or so this was another long conversation. And then you get these 5 lines. Again, Marta put in the definite article here, you are not a flower of the foreign strain, but that sounds very strange in English. So I said, maybe you should change it to you are not a flower of foreign strain and foreign blood. And so again, this toing and froing and toing and froing. And I said, yes, I realise that my Polish friends, they find an issue. So it just went on and on like that, and this kind of semi-intellectual discussion of language. And sometimes I just go a bit sort of crazy with trying to take it all in and then help Marta produce something that an English-speaking reader would understand. So there's some examples there. Another slide, please, Anouk. And then we went down lots of rabbit holes. And I chose to show you this one. So this was an entry by Kazimierza Lipinska, and she says, she labels it Warsaw, the boarding school for girls. So I asked Marta, do we know the name of this boarding school that Helena went to? And she said, no, not really. We don't know for sure. How could we know? And then there was the question of, well, if you call it the boarding school, that implies that it is an actual school. But if we can't identify it, so then we went off, Marta particularly went off to 1905 directories and everything to find out what sort of boarding school might have been around and might have been the one that Helena attended. We actually, as it turned out, there were many private secondary schools which had boarding facilities in Warsaw in 1905, and we couldn't really decide on which one it might have been. So that was indeed a really interesting rabbit hole. And one more slide, please, Anu. But the big bonus of this translation is Marta's footnotes. Where, because she's an academic, she went into a lot of research and detail about, in this case, the author of that poem about the Polish language. She writes a small biography, then she says when it was first published and where, and you can go and look at it here, and then it was published in another journal. So this is now giving it substance. And a scholar or somebody who's really interested could go and find out even more about the author, about the poem. And just one other one is a comment about Adam Mickiewicz, who is Poland's hero in poetic hero. And again, the story of who he's writing to, where it was published. So these are bonuses that you don't expect to get. And there are many of them, many. So Marta has done a sterling job there as well. One more slide, I think perhaps or not. Okay, so I'm going to leave this on the screen because I'm now going to tell you a little bit about Krysia, who brought the book to Sydney. So Helena and Abraham Tabañska lived with their daughters, Irena, who was born in 1908, and Friederike Christina, or known as Krysia, who was born in 1912, in a large apartment on Siena Street in Warsaw. Siena Street is still there, but it's not the street it was. And it was always a desirable street, even when it found itself in the small ghetto, once the ghetto was established. They were a secular Jewish family, but went to synagogue on high holidays. At around age 19 or 20, Krysia married Michal Ilutowicz, and that is Michal there on the left, seated with a friend and a tennis racket. I've been wondering for a long time now whether that tennis racket is just a photographer's prop or not. But anyway, there they are. He was a friend of her sister's. After the Nazi invasion, he fled east like many Polish Jews, but returned to Warsaw to be with her. Abraham's chemical and soap factory was seized by the Nazis, and he soon died of typhus. In the ghetto, Michal worked in rubbish removal. This gave him access to the Aryan side when he was able to arrange hiding places for Krysia. She cared for Irena's son. You can see Irena and her son Włodarz, while Irena and Helena worked in a brush making factory. Helena was deported to Treblinka, Irena and Włodarz to Majdanek, and Michal was executed by firing squad at the age of 31. Now, Krysia had no papers. She hadn't really concluded her education, so she didn't have much of a standing in terms of being able to protect herself. So she lived in constant danger, moving between hiding places before finally sheltering on a farm in Pruszków until liberation by the Soviets. With help from Michal's brother in Australia, she reached Sydney in February 1948, where she later married Isaac Turek, a widower with 2 children. Though she had no children of her own, Krysia became a devoted mother and grandmother and was deeply loved in return. Krysia remembered Helena's album from her early days and remembered how Helena always admired the beautiful writing and penmanship. We don't know exactly how or when Krysia obtained the album, but she kept it with her throughout all her movements in hiding and to Australia until she died in Sydney in 2008. It was the only memento of her beloved mother. And with foresight, her granddaughter Yvonne, who's listening in tonight, donated it to the Sydney Jewish Museum, which has looked after it very, very beautifully. So that's to introduce you to Krysia. And when you listen to her testimony, she is such a lovely, lovely, lovely woman. So this is one of those street photographs of Krysia and Helena. And Krysia looks so gorgeous, so poised, so elegant. It's a miracle, I think. It's lovely. Helena, on the other hand, looks a little bit troubled. So from the costumes, from the clothing, I guess it's certainly in the mid-30s or something. And here are the 2 little girls, Irena and Krysia, in their beautiful, beautiful dresses. So that is our lovely family tonight. So Anouk, are there any questions yet?
Let me check.
Okay.
I cannot see any questions, but Yvonne left a really sweet message saying Krysia would always speak so highly of how beautiful it was. I always thought she was talking about the handwriting, but now I realize it was also about the beauty of the poetry as well.
Oh, thank you, Yvonne. That's really, really lovely to hear. Okay, so I have quite a few questions, by the way. Marta, you were talking about the touch of these books and that these girls carried it with them and then passed them around, even in the camps and the ghettos. And tell us what that is. That it's called hapticity, yeah? Tell us why that's important and why you think they should be collected not as diaries or letters, but more as Holocaust objects.
Rita, this is a very complicated question. Actually, there are 3 or 4 questions within your question. So maybe
Yes, I'm
Professor
sorry.
Holc will answer this question about hapticity, and I will answer the one about the Holocaust object.
Sure.
Okay.
So, to have an autograph album means you had to hand it over, right, to your friend, your acquaintance, for them to sign it. And sometimes, if they wanted to be really memorable, they would keep it for a bit. They would create a drawing, and we can see with these poems, if you remember the handwriting, there aren't any smudges or crossouts. These people had sat down and had probably already written the poem out themselves in a separate place, right? And then written it. They wanted to be careful. They knew that it would be looked at in the future many times, and they wanted to make an impression. And so in a poesy album or an autograph book, you gave it over to somebody, and they held it, right? They held it. They wrote. Sometimes they folded a corner. Sometimes, and not so much in our examples, but in some other ones we found they would fold the corner and say, don't look under here. They would turn it upside down. They would put in stickers or drawings. They would create stencils. And these albums, when the owner got them back, it wasn't just a collection of names of people. It was really a collection of touch. These albums became a vessel or a repository of touch. And it was required, right? If you had an autograph album, somebody had to touch it. And of course, you touched it as you were hiding it. And people these were not permitted, in forced labor camps. They also didn't want to lose them. They didn't want someone to take them away, roughly, a guard. So they were moved around, they were hidden. So we found it very compelling that in a time of despair, a time of dehumanization, a time of isolation, a time of the Nazi regime wanting to murder the Jews of Europe, there are these items that kind of hold human touch. And we wanted to describe that, not just in terms of a person, but in terms of the actual book. We can see that with the softness of the cover of Helena's and the beadwork in Dvořák's, the other example. And as Marta said, in how the pages were touched later in the future. So we really wanted to stress how important it was that these items facilitated actual human touch at a time when of great extreme fear and extreme threat. Marta, did you want to add anything to that?
I always watch these albums, and I pay attention to all these traces of touch, traces of tears, because we also have in those albums, the traces left on this object on those pages that can tell us about its history, what happened to the object. There are objects that were, for example, buried in the ground, like Rutka's album. So we can also learn about the history of the object from the way it appears, from all those destructions, from all those elements that show what happened to this object during all these years. So this is very important for us when we study these objects. We really examine them carefully, looking for those traces of those touch and what happened to them. And maybe I will refer to the other part of the question Rita asked, because Rita also asked about Helena Tabañska's autograph album as an object, as a Holocaust object, because this is also important in our research. What made this object a Holocaust object? So this story of Helena's album, it really shows us, speaks to the role of this personal object in the history of the Holocaust. And this minor, apparently trivial items have had a very big value to their owners. So imagine those girls keeping and hiding those albums in the most difficult minutes, more difficult hours, days of their lives in those camps, in those ghettos, in the hiding, and they keep those objects, they circulate them, they collect the entries, even the most hard situation. So they have extreme values. They seem to have extreme values to their owners, and they reveal significant aspects of historical experience of every person. Actually, examining those other autograph albums, they really make us understand that they kind of create a separate narrative regarding the individual biography, the separate narrative, separate from the one that we can learn from the, for example, a testimony given to a Shoah Foundation. They reveal different aspects of the individual history, in different aspects of individual biography. So they are very interesting for us in this context.
Yeah, thanks, Marta. It's really fascinating. And are you saying that museums, Holocaust museums, have been treating these more as diaries or letters rather than these personal objects full of these verses and things like that? Are you saying that there's been a move to collecting these as Holocaust objects? Is that a recent thing?
It's hard to say because each archive and each museum is different. I think this might blend in with how women's, materials are treated. This is personal writing. Sometimes it's considered girlish or unserious to have a little album like this. And so different archives and different museums see them, sometimes don't know what to do with them and consider them either put them in a big folder that says personal items, or call them a journal, or call them a poetry album, where it seems as if it's someone's poetry, someone's personal poetry, and so there is a big turn towards a focus on objects, and we're very happy about that, and we think everyone will benefit from that. But we're very happy with how the Sydney Jewish Museum has showcased this. I don't know, you want to say a little more about that, Marta?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I believe that this album, this Helena's album, could be also displayed with this story, because this I think it's the story, the album itself was an object, and the whole story, and the object together with the testimony. This is a very valuable educational material, in my opinion. So we can learn a lot about the history of the family, of the Jewish family in Warsaw. We can learn about the Holocaust. We can learn about the immigration, about the post-war experiences of a Jewish survivor. So I think this is a very valuable item in the context of education.
I can't agree more. I haven't actually seen the photograph album, because by the time we started working on it, it had been packed away because the museum was closing for renovation, and they had to pack up all the archives and take them off the premises so they wouldn't get damaged in any way or collect dust. So I'd never laid eyes on it, but I actually wrote to Yvonne a few weeks ago, and I said, the museum has labelled it as a silk cover, but I said to Yvonne, I think it looks like velvet rather than silk, and she agreed, but we might have to take that up with the curators. Now, when we were preparing yesterday, Janine, I asked you, and Marta, do you have any other stories about the books that were made in the camps? Any examples that you might be able to tell us about?
One of the most impressive examples is the one that I showed with the beadwork. And one of the things I didn't say that Marta and I have discussed a lot about this cover is that first of all, this cover was made from materials that they just improvised. So they're in a forced labor camp in Parshnitz, which was part of the Gross-Rosen subcamp system. It's 1944, so it's a period in which Parshnitz has turned from a forced labor camp to an actual concentration camp. There's almost no food. It's overcrowded. And here they are finding thread, beads, material for a cover, and time. They are finding time to very carefully stitch the cover, to, and then to write in it. Again, as I said, to hold it and write poetry in it. And it's the capacity of Jewish girls and young women to sustain their creativity and their care for each other in the most horrible circumstances, just completely, it impressed us. It was so remarkable. And you can see it in these objects. And that's why, as Marta said, personal objects had a great value to people suffering persecution in the Holocaust, but they also have a great value to us today. Marta and I hope, I saw a question about what's next for the project. We would like to assemble an analysis, just as we did today, of Helena and Krysia. We would like to write a book with different chapters on different books and how they came into the museum or archives, and the persecution journeys of the owners and the journeys of the objects. Because as you can see, it is just fascinating. In fact, we could talk for a long time, couldn't we, Rita and Marta, about all of it?
I was reading in your paper, you talked about a little 1-inch square book, but you didn't describe it very deeply, and I'm so fascinated by it. Can you tell us how you can keep how you can write in a 1-inch square book?
I'm going to answer because that was the part I wrote in the article, so I don't want to talk over Marta, but this is really, I'm going to change your question a little bit, which is,
sure,
how can you hide a book? You're in a forced labor camp. You have one uniform or one dress you wear every day. Well, you make it very small. So this is the kind of ways these objects were also shaped by the circumstances. So there is a book that was written about, not by us, but by the famous scholar Marianne Hirsch, and they found by a doctor, a male doctor, had been given a 1-inch square tiny collection of pages in which the prisoners had, to honor him, had made little drawings without their names. And, it was a way, they didn't want to get him into trouble. So it was something very, very tiny. So these books functioned inside of the universe of persecution. I think Rita, do we have any questions?
I can't see the questions, I'm sorry.
We do.
Yeah. Okay.
And one of the questions is, how did you develop passion for this topic, for this work? And that's to each and every one of you.
I
So
think
maybe I will
Marta
start
and
this time. Okay, I can say that I started to develop my interest in Holocaust objects a long time ago. So I started objects on the exhibitions, like Sobibor exhibition, where in Poland there is a museum with in Sobibor, in a former death camp at Sobibor, and they have a very interesting museum where they display objects that belong to the prison, to the victims of the camp, and who were buried in the ground, and then later after the war they were discovered. Objects like, for example, a badge with a Mickey Mouse which belonged to a child. And I started to develop interest in Holocaust object, and we worked a lot with Professor Holc on different projects, and we were discussing those Holocaust objects, and she started her research on this autograph albums that were held by women in forced labor camps, and that's how we started to work on this project together.
Janine?
I agree. As I think everybody can see, they are fascinating, and they are about human expression. Again, just to repeat, at the risk of repeating myself, at a time of starvation, dehumanization, utter fear, it's amazing.
Yeah, I read in one of the things you wrote, I can't remember, I think it was you, Janine, that keeping or creating these personal objects was often more important than having a utilitarian item such as a spoon, because of the assertion of one's humanity and dissociation from the horrible reality of how they were living, and to fantasize and think about the future. So, which is a remarkable thing, that you're willing to, say, give up a spoon in favour of this little book. I guess it's the humanity of it. Would you agree?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Were there any other questions, Eva?
I'm also
Not
looking
at this
in the
stage,
meantime.
nothing, but we could encourage people to post some questions in the
I
comments
see
again.
Yvonne is typing.
Oh,
Yes.
Yvonne is back. Well, that's good. We like things from Yvonne.
I have a question. What did you learn from this project that you didn't know before?
Well, I learned mostly from Marta the complex, textured social world of Jewish and non-Jewish teenage girls in these high schools, and the poetry and the specific meaning of these poems at a time when Poland was controlled by Russia, for sure. And it's amazing to me. You can read a thick history book, but just looking at this these handwritten poems, I don't know, it's almost like a whole different way of understanding it.
And I've learned how much this singular little object can be valued as a memento in such a dramatic times of the World War II and the Holocaust. So I try to understand what value this little album in a red velvet cover had for Christina, and I was trying to imagine her carrying this album with her and moving through this card and touching this card with her father saying I love you to her mother, and what value it had to her, how it helped her when she was in living her most desperate moments. So I was trying to imagine what kind of value this object had for her.
Also, just to add to that, so although the Siena house was inside the borders of the ghetto, people were displaced very frequently, and Helena, the mother, had to separate from Frederica, Christina, the daughter, and her husband, and live elsewhere. Helena ended up being able to work in a factory, and Christina lived within her husband, worked, as was said, in the rubbish, bringing it back and forth. And it was very difficult for them to meet and see each other. And by 1943, it was a time where you weren't even allowed to walk in the streets of the ghetto. You could be shot at any moment. And the idea that somehow this poetry book got passed from mother to daughter in that period of time is just, I think, just supports some of the things Marta and Rita were saying about how important this album was, for people.
And for it to still be in such beautiful condition, given that it's over 100. It's well over 100 years old, and it's not pristine because it has been touched by so many hands, but it certainly looks really, really fresh. This thing about the penmanship and the handwriting that Yvonne told us that Krysia remembered her mother talking about the beautiful handwriting, always talking about the beautiful handwriting. What is that about socially? What does that tell us about the caliber of these girls who are and the people who are writing in the book?
Well, these poems were things that were very well known in Polish culture, and Marta can say a little bit more. But if you were living in Warsaw in the 19th and early 20th century, these poems were taught. They were constantly, like at any event, these were just part of Polish national culture. And so these girls, again, I don't know if this got stressed enough, but the album has both Jewish and Polish girls, Jewish and non-Jewish girls writing poems. They were in school together at this stage. And they were people whose parents had money and had decided to, as Marta said very well, enroll them in a private school.
And on that note, I think we're well and truly out of time. So a big thank you to Rita, to Marta, and to Janine. Before I hand over to Rita for a final word. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you, Marta and Janine. Thank you, Janine, particularly for having to get up so early. And thank you for writing about poesy books and bringing them to world attention, as you clearly are doing. To Marta for translating and researching all the Polish and some French entries. To Marina for translating entries from the Russian. To Yvonne for donating the book to the museum. To Ros Sugarman of the curatorial department at the Sydney Jewish Museum for looking after it. To Izzy Munell for the beautiful flyer you created using the images of the book. And to Anouk and Eva at Polaron for the brilliant tech expertise and the support that you gave us. And I decided we should dedicate this whole webinar. Oh, someone's putting hearts on it. This webinar to Helena for creating her beautiful album, and to her daughter for cherishing it and bringing it to Australia. Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Helena and Krysia. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I hope you found it enlightening, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, and good night. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.